Welcome, everyone. Good evening from Jerusalem. Welcome to the 6th Annual Documentary Film Festival from the National Library of Israel, Docu.Text 06. This event will begin in just a few seconds, sorry. The event is following the screening of the movie Golda, and Dr. Michal Asaf Kremer will speak of Golda's decision-making process. Thank you very much. Good evening and enjoy.
Hello, everyone. My name is Michal Asaf Kremer, and our lecture today will deal with decision-making in time of crisis, then and now, according to the 5 principles. We will focus on analysis of decision-making in leadership by applying methodology of 5 principles based on the book that I wrote about Golda Meir's foreign decision-making process, published by a Cambridge publisher, Schooler. And we will demonstrate leadership in decision-making analysis throughout the case study of Golda Meir's foreign decision-making process during the period of 1970 till 1973. This lecture has 2 main sources of inspiration. One is, like I mentioned before, the book that I wrote, the research regarding Golda Meir's foreign decision-making process. This research conducted it's based on a triangulation of documents analysis, interviews, previous researches about foreign relations, and also about decision-making in leadership. In addition, it's based on another research that I conducted recently, the 70 research, focused on decision-making in productive leadership, interviews with 70 leading leaders in their field from different sectors. And also another inspiration is my professional experience as the curator of Mabat Institute for Intercultural Global Leadership, work with institutions in Israel such as the IDF, healthcare campuses, and high-tech companies. As you will see today, I chose the train motif to express the several factors that exist during the decision-making process. The motif train comes to symbolize the importance of the 5 principles in decision-making, which will be presented through the factors involved. The role of the trains is to take people to a specific destination. There are stops on the way where it is possible to get on or off. There is a locomotive driver, there are rules, and there is a driving track. This principle will be valid always. Human nature and human spirit do not change. The differences between the periods is only technological gap. The main challenge of the lecture and also for the research that I conducted is the combination between 3 challenges. One is the historical, to realize what were the dominant events that took place in decision-making process and which factors influenced Golda Meir's decision-making process. Another field is the decision-making challenge, how to characterize her foreign decision-making process by implementing various approaches. And the methodology challenge, which combined the previous 2, the historical decision, how to create comprehensive perspective that we can combine between the research field and the events. My assumption were and still that the characterization and understanding of leadership decision-making process can be achieved by adopting broad and deep perspective that is connected to both the world of research and the reality. The events took place in the reality. That's why I focus on several case studies. I implement various decision-making approaches, such as the rational, bureaucratic, psychological, like I will mention today in our lecture. And let's start. So the first principle number 1 is to identify the main stations in decision. And it means to emphasize the need for decision-making points. Before we are going to drill down to the events to implement this principle, the decision-making points principle, a few highlights regarding from Golda Meir's life. Golda was born in Kiev, Russia, Ukraine these days. Our days, she moved with her family when she was 7 years old to Wisconsin, United States, and moved to Israel when she was the age of 23 with her husband and her sister. Golda served as the 4th Prime Minister of Israel. She served as a senior politician during 3 wars, Hattusha War, 6-Day War, and the Yom Kippur. During the Yom Kippur War, she served as a Prime Minister of Israel, a war that risked Israel's existence. And then she dealt with crucial military and foreign decision-making challenges while surrounded by experienced male generals. So when we are looking at the book and the research that I conducted, I chose to focus on 3 case studies. I will mention today 2. The first is the American Peace Initiative from June 19, from 1970. The second is ending of the status quo between Israel and Egypt from the end of February till October 6th. And the third regarding forces separation agreement between Israel and Egypt. And I will focus now in my example on the American Peace Initiative from 1970. We can see here that there are several decision-making points. But maybe I will introduce a general background regarding each of decision-making point. The first, we start with the initial reaction to the declaration. But like I said, a short background about it. President Nixon, we are talking about 1970, President Nixon administration was preoccupied with involvement in the Vietnam War and sought to lower the flames in the Middle East. The task assigned to Secretary of State William Rogers and his assistant Joseph Sisco. In mid-June 1970, the U.S. Peace Initiative was introduced, calling on the parties to stop the fire, to negotiate under the UN representative Yaring, and in order to implement UN Security Council Resolution 242. The initiative presented in a meeting between Golda and Evan, the foreign minister of Israel then, by the ambassador to Israel, the U.S. ambassador to Israel, Barbo. Golda's first reaction was objection. Later in the cabinet, she called the initiative a trap. Golda actually identified 2 major issues in the initiative. 2 problematic major issues. One is the content of the American Peace Initiative and its terms, which require change in Israel's borders as per UN Resolution 242, presented a threat to Israel's secure borders and were identified as a negative turning point in the Israeli-United States relationship. The second problematic issue was the way in which the initiative was presented. It expressed a new American approach to the process, which indicate a link between Israeli obedience and continued American military assistance. At the event progress. Golda received a personal letter from President Nixon. Now we are in decision-making 2. First message to President Nixon, how to react. President Nixon sent her a message which he urged her to respond positively to the initiative, and even assures her that no Israeli soldier will withdraw from his place in a way that endanger the security of Israel. As we know, at the end of July 1970, supported by a government, Golda decided to accept the American initiative led by Rogers and to appoint a representative to a peace talks led by Yaring. It was after, and it was actually in light of the Egyptian and the Soviet agreements. After that, we can see the draft crisis with Kissinger. It was about a different. It was actually focused on the phrasing of the proposal. The American version was different from that approved by Golda, which created a great tension between Meir and Kissinger. And eventually, at the end of this case study, at the end of this event, at midnight, between 7 to 8 August 1970, the ceasefire, which formally ended, supposed to end the war of attrition between Israel and Egypt, when it's supposed to begin, at the very same night, the Egyptian advanced ground-to-air muscle towards the canal, which was contrary to the agreement to freeze military activity. So actually, we are talking about Egyptian-Soviet ceasefire violation. What is important to know the main stations in decision-making process? So each decision event includes several decision-making points. It is important to identify them since it is important to not miss the opportunity to influence when there is a real decision junction. And Golda know to identify these junctions. It is important not to create an overdoing and overreacting that might erode the process. And for nowadays, as we can learn, it is important to remember that not every tweet on Twitter is a decision-making point, is a station. So we're going to move to principle 2, dominant triggers. When we are talking about dominant triggers, we are talking about the influencing dominant factors on the process, on the decision-making process. And continuing with this example, with the American Initiative Peace example, we can find several dominant influencing factors, mainly the relationship with the United States and the relationship between the superpower, United States and the Soviet Union, and the relationship between the Soviet Union and Egypt. As we know, at that period, the Soviet Union strengthened their presence in the area. And so the relationship between Egypt and the Soviet Union was a warm relationship. We have to remember in this principle that there are always dominant factors that need to be followed, as we have seen in the example of the Soviet military presence, when in the future, Soviet military advisors and their families were evacuated from Egypt before the attack on Israel on October 6th. And this, in retrospect point of view, we know that this was a clear evidence to Egypt's intention to attack Israel. So this was very important to follow after this dominant influence factor. In the case of the crisis before us, we can learn that locating the dominant influencing factor, identify as objectively as possible, is the task that is required before making decisions. Influencing factors must include today economic aspects, spiritual aspects, and emotional aspects, similar to the aspects that create our quality of life. Identify and follow the triggers, the main influencing dominant factors, and I recommend to focus on 3 to 5, recognize their development direction, and use them and their values in every discussion and meeting. The third principle is the main role. And here we are talking about what is the main aspect, what is the dominant aspect of the decision-making point. Each decision-making point, as I mentioned before and gave example for the American Peace Initiative, has its own dominant aspect, whether it's political, bureaucratic, irrational, or psychological. Now, I will take 5 minutes about decision-making approaches and their aspects that influencing us and our leaders in decision-making process, and also then I will implement it and show how these aspects influenced Golda decision-making that day. The main approaches that we have today in leadership are mainly rational approach, bureaucratic approach, and psychological approach, including the irrational factors, which is became approach by itself since the research there is wide. When we are talking about rational aspects, it's based on rational approach. The basic proposition in decision-making. Rational approach is the basic proposition, and it's actually the first approach in decision-making. The basic understanding of this elusive concept and the assumption that people can choose to be rational creatures is a significant basis for all research and for all life challenges, for all our life challenges. There are many applications of rational approach, and I prefer to use the rational model of Cashman. And you can see that we are talking about 8 stages. Start with identify problem, identify goal, gather information, identify and analyze the alternatives, then select alternative, implement decision, and eventually monitor and evaluate. Sorry? Okay. When we are talking about bureaucratic aspect, where it's based on bureaucratic approach, we have 2 main approaches. One, view decision in international policy making on products on SOP, standard operational procedures. And the second mentioned and the second approach based on governmental politics aspect, emphasize politic aspects. And it views decision output as outcome of accumulated effect of a dynamic struggle between players enacting political roles and dividing on national question. The third is psychological aspects. We have 2 streams. A psychodynamic stream based on Freud and his follower. The second is cognitive stream, which I focus on. aim to view decision makers' solidly held beliefs as a basis for their decision making. This approach does not attempt to locate the internal source that influenced on decision maker. Like I mentioned before, I didn't focus on the internal characteristics of Golda Meir's foreign decisions. However, I researched the irrational aspect that was involved during the process. The irrational factors are systematic errors that tend to arise in certain circumstances. And after this brief knowledge about decision-making approaches, we are going to drill down again to the events, to the historical events. So now we are talking about the second case study. For me, it's the second case study, which focuses on the ending of the status quo between Israel and Egypt relation. Also here, I will talk about general background to understand the aspect that were influencing during the decision-making points. So in late February 1973, an advisor to the U.S. President of National Security and its Egyptian counterpart, Hafez Ismail, held 2 secret meetings in the United States, during which Ismail presented Egypt's position in detail, what is known today as the Egyptian Peace Initiative from 1973. Ismail proposed an arrangement that would lead to a state of peace, rather than a peace that includes normalization of the relation. Egypt refused then to a separate agreement with Israel, but bound the solution in a comprehensive Israeli-Arab solution, which talked about the arrangement of relations between Israel and Syria in Jordan to resolve the future of the Palestinians in the West Bank, and to determine the future of the residents of Gaza residents, to establish an independent entity or whatever they choose. Document analysis reveals that by the Israeli intelligence experts reveals that this proposal was actually more detailed repetition of position presented in the past. Egypt was insisted in progress on all fronts at the same time and will be implemented mostly within 6 or 7 months. She insisted that it will be implemented. It seems that then the positions of Israel and Egypt were unbridgeable with respect to a comprehensive settlement, a comprehensive arrangement. Israel did not see it, Golda did not see it as a basis for negotiation. There was a very large gap in all issues, in all the main issues. The issue of borders, the issue of the militarization, and the issue of the essence of the peace. While Egypt talked about a state of peace, Israel talked about full peace with normalization. And now we can look about the first decision-making point, and we can see respond to the Egyptian Peace Initiative. After we understand all the detail, we can understand why Israel reject or didn't accept the initiative. Continuing with the event on May 17, 1973, during discussion about the possibility the possibilities, a preventative war or preemptive strike, were considered. It was decided both by political and general staff that for political reasons, Israel could not start preventative war but a preemptive strike. The IDF raised its level, and now we are in decision making 2, reaction to Egypt's threats of war. The IDF raised its level of preparedness in various ways within the framework of blue-white preparation between May to August 1973. On the night of October 3, Israeli intelligence received a warning, but urged convincingly that with regard to Egypt, the reports showed that if war was to break out, there would be at least 24 hours warning. As described earlier, on the morning on Friday 5th, October 5th, Meir received a report of the evacuation of the Soviet families unexpectedly. The head of intelligence of the Israeli intelligence was sure that likelihood that Egypt was about to attack was very low. Golda chose to adopt his confidence and not to conduct early preventative attack against Egypt, and perceived this decision as a promise of political cooperation between and military support from the United States. When we want to analyze and understand these decision-making points with the connection to the decision-making approaches, with the connection with the research actually, we have to focus on one decision-making point and try to understand what are the dominant aspects within it. So, for example, I chose to emphasize it by focus on an early preventative attack against Egypt decision-making point. And here I found we can see bureaucratic political aspect, a dominant aspect of bureaucratic political by the power struggle between dominant senior officials at the head of the Israeli leaders, had a significant impact on Meir's decision-making point. In addition, we can find here irrational aspect, and especially experts, overconfidence, illusion, and optimism bias. Overconfidence of experts, illusion of the head of the Israeli information, who believed that Egypt will not start a war and suffered from illusion of overconfidence bias. Optimism bias. The document analysis reveals that the level of confidence and certainty among Meir's most influential advisors were particularly high. From the words of Moshe Dayan at the cabinet meeting October 7, he said, I underestimated the enemy's strength, their fighting weight, and I overestimated our forces and their ability to face them. The Arabs are fighting much better than previously. I had a feeling that we would hammer them in the past. Our evaluation was based on the previous war, and it was incorrect. We and others estimated incorrectly what would happen in the attempt to cross. And these words say everything. We can understand that the identify of the decision-making point aspect can contribute us to understand the needs to be given in the specific event. Let's move on to principle number 4, and now we are talking about the needs for rational track. Rational track. During the research that I conducted regarding Golda Meir's foreign decision-making process, I analyzed 20 different decision-making points, which mean 20 different sub-events from the period between 1970 to 1973. In each of them, I found a certain influencing dominant aspect. Like I mentioned before, like I said before, irrational biases of the expert surrounded her, of fear and risk, overconfidence of expert biases, influential of organization bureaucratic aspect, and dominant political as well. However, and it is important to me to emphasize it, that's why I wrote it word by word, throughout all the events, I found a unified line of a continuous rational model as will presented. We already see this rational model by Cashman. And this is the strategic map which can emphasize all the factors that I presented until now. We can see at the bottom of the map the influencing decision factors regarding American initiative peace. We can see a foreign relation between superpowers, the superpowers foreign relation between Israel and the US, the foreign relations between Egypt and the Soviets, and the foreign relation between Egypt and the US. At the left side, there is the rational model presented, the stages, and the spiral is symbolizing of the rational, the timeline, the event through the timeline. So the red point is the decision-making points. So these strategic map actually present the whole perspective. Also here, the ending of the status quo in Israel and Egyptian relationship. I focus on 3 decision-making points. There is the rational model. If you want to drill down more, I invite you to read my book and to see how the decision, the rational decision implements through Golda Meir's process, decision-making process. Here it's the third case study, which we are not talking about today. So the rational track, decision-making must be based on a rational and systematic process, based on opinions of experts, professional, eliminating irrational biases such as moods, ego struggles, and various background noises. The goal must be to be on the rational spiral process, which begins with a clear common goal. Strive to stay on the spiral, on the rational spiral, and identify the influencing aspects. This is, I believe, the main, my dominant conclusion from the research regarding Golda Meir's foreign decision-making process. And now, principle number 5 regarding the main concept, principle before personality. And I summarize it by the sentence, when a strategic decision needs to be made, then following the rational process and the significant principles is by far more important than the leader personality. Principle before personality can be achieved by focusing on three values. I call it how: honesty, open-minded, and willingness to take decision, making steps, and also implement it while emphasizing a high level of rational process, like we saw at Golda Meir's example. So the 5 main principles that I presented today were to remember and to identify the main stations, the decision-making points, to recognize the dominant triggers, the influencing dominant factors, to know the main role, the influencing dominance aspect. It was connecting with connection to the decision-making approaches, rational track, and the main concept is principle before personality. I start with inspiration and I will end with inspiration. We wish to have leadership with with rational decision making, like we all know and we all want in our days, in our challenges days. So all the best, and in Hebrew we say bsorot tovot. Thank you very much.